And ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be giving this lecture, this Zurich Lecture. It's also a pleasure because that allows me to see some old friends and see the wonderful work which is being done in this UBS Center in terms of attracting talent and getting policy issues in the forefront. There's been a lot of very interesting stuff said today, so I don't have that much to add actually to what has been said. Maybe I can give a different twist, different angle to that thing. And I will proceed in two parts, maybe three. The first part will be discussing what the report I just delivered with Olivier Blanchard for President Macron, which was a report with 24 economists plus the two of us, on three major challenges: climate change, inequality, and aging. And I'm going to tell you what basically the Commission said with a little bit of my grain of salt in it, but by and large what the Commission said. And then, that's advice for the policymakers. And then we move on to the social responsibility, because that's something which was discussed heavily today as well, also in very interesting ways. So the report with Olivier Blanchard starts with the obvious, the urgency. There's been a tremendous delay in decarbonization and green R&D. A few good news that were discussed today, of course, solar and wind, lead, electric vehicles, alternative proteins, vertical farms, but by and large, the good news are scarce. And one good news is that, at least in France, it's actually widely perceived by citizens as being urgent, with a couple of twists. So 90% of the French actually think that it's very urgent to act, but 90% also think that even someone from the middle class should not have to spend any euro on doing it. So that's a bit worrisome in terms of perception. There are correct perceptions. So, for example, people realize that there are losers and winners. It's not a scoop. We know from the yellow jackets that the case. Many green policies are regressive. So basically, low-income households pay a higher fraction of their income in the carbon tax, for example. But that's true for most green policies. Who owns an electric car, right? Who owns an apartment or a house where you can put solar panels on it, and so on and so forth. Now, something which won't surprise you either is that visible policies are much more unpopular than invisible ones. So the carbon tax was, of course, a no-no in France, whereas cap and trade, that has been so for a long time, which is very similar to a carbon tax, people haven't caught up quite. That's going to happen, but haven't caught up with it quite. The feed-in tariffs, the subsidies for renewables and insulations, the standard bans are kind of neutral or even popular. Even so, some of them cost much, much more per ton of CO2 saved than a carbon tax. And that's very interesting, because if you spend 1,000 euros to save 1 ton of carbon, when for 40 euros you could get rid of coal for 40 euros per ton, that means that with your 1,000 euros you could have economized 25 tons. So it's not really a green policy to do that. Another thing that this is more my touch on it. There is all this talk about green jobs and green growth, happy energy transition, having one's cake and eating it too. And I dislike that for some reason. And first, it's not grounded in economics, but also in terms of political economy, that raises the issue of whether we should actually put some effort into fighting climate change. If we can grow faster and at the same time be green, and the question is, of course, for 30 years, 200 countries haven't done that. So why is that? But it's kind of dangerous speech, I think. So on each of the topics we covered, we had some kind of holistic perspective. So on climate change, for example, we said carbon price. It's absolutely necessary. I mean, the 26 members of the commission were kind of totally unanimous on that. That won't surprise you. Why? Well, for the usual reasons. We want to give the right incentives, not spend more than necessary. And having a uniform price, of course, helps you save money. It's still going to be expensive, but it helps you spend money. It's also well known that it's going to encourage R&D because, you know, if you do green R&D, you're going to make money out of your licenses, and if there is no carbon price in the future, there won't be any money to be made. And finally, something which is less well known is that it's a simple strategy. You know, it doesn't require much information that the government doesn't have. So it's very important because we have billions of decisions to take, including the government, but also it's simple for us as households. So you're in Zurich, you're going to go this weekend to the marketplace, and you're going to choose some tomatoes. Some tomatoes will come from Spain through trucks. It emits CO2. Some others will be grown locally in a greenhouse. And the question is, you as a consumer, which tomato should you choose? Well, the answer is you don't know. At least I don't. In the end, if you don't have a carbon price, it's almost impossible to tell. More in detail, the Commission concluded there should be no exemptions because they're unfair, they're prone to lobbying, and so on. And of course, no subsidies for fossil fuel. That's kind of obvious. A little bit less obvious, we decided in favor of carbon tax adjustment. And the reason is very simple, which is that if you start having a decent carbon price, which we haven't had so far, then there will be offshoring. You need a level playing field, and if you don't have a carbon tax adjustment, then your carbon price is not going to fly. At the same time, we know that we don't have the information to have a good carbon border tax adjustment. We're going to tax the product as opposed to the emissions. That's not quite fair, that's not right. It may also give rise to protectionism. We have to be careful about that. We voted, in quotes, for an expansion of the ETS system in Europe, adding a price floor and a price cap. And the idea is, well, there is a lot of uncertainty, both about the technology and about societal acceptance. But we have to give some visibility, at least, for investment decisions. Many decisions we have to make are going to be, having effects for 5, 10, 30 years, and we need to have some visibility on that. And we could do it at the European level. We could also have a carbon central bank, which basically will stabilize somewhat, will have a clear mission, and then will stabilize somewhat the price and have forward guidance. An explicit redistribution to losers, that's very important. Of course, being French, Olivier and I, of course, went through the yellow jackets, but that's very important if you want to have acceptability. We economists, we don't like to earmark some income to some policy, but in this case, it seems very important to redistribute. I mean, I know you have been discussing that in Switzerland. Maybe a uniform check, maybe a check for the low-income people. And that applies also to the Green Deal, because I'm a bit concerned the Green Deal hasn't thought much enough about redistribution. Second item, surprise, surprise, more R&D, more green R&D. We are way behind, given the stakes. We need to make significant technological progress. So, for example, storage technology for wind and solar. Why? I mean, because there is a high probability that the carbon price will be too low anyway. And there are lots of different externalities too. Actually, David Emusi has worked on that. So we need to have some big push for technology. That was already said today. And in the report, we push for an EU ARPA-E kind of institution, which will be an independent institution, which will be doing industrial policy, but will be doing it the right way. If you do it the wrong way, don't do industrial policy, please. And I could give you lots of examples of that. And the way you have to do it is to have a real manager who is independent from politics, if possible, a scientist who is knowledgeable about those things is going to take into account supply and demand. You know, politicians always have a demand for something. They don't even wonder whether the soil is fertile. You have to evaluate the work, stop when it doesn't work, set objective and not strategies. Okay, so just think about vaccines, for example. We didn't want to have a strategy, we want to have a target, right? And that's very important. Associate private sector when feasible and so on. So, you know, common sense stuff, but this common sense is almost always absent in some of the industrial policies we see in Europe. And the other thing that we all agree on in this commission is don't put all your eggs in the same basket, because basically you don't know which technology is going to work. And each lobbyist will tell you, I know, but no, the answer is we don't know. And you know, if we had done that for vaccines, we would not be together today, I guess. Standards and mandates, economists like that a bit less. You need that to some extent. Again, because the price of carbon is likely to be too low in practice for political reasons. Because it's more for households actually than for firms. So you may want to, you know, they are very poorly informed, they may be liquidity constrained, they may face collective action problems, like in collective housing, for example, and sometimes it's also how to measure emissions. So, you know, after all, standards and bans can be useful sometimes, but what you have got to do is to try to have at least a rough estimate of how much it costs per ton of carbon avoided. Okay, that's what you have got to do. So what you need, and we don't have in France, but you know, is you could do it at the EU level in an independent agency which evaluates the cost of various policies, so that we have a ballpark estimate of how much it will cost, just not to spend 1,000 euros when you could be spending, you know, 30 euros, for example. That's kind of obvious. Electricity. Electricity, we noted, everybody knows that the consumption of electricity is going to grow very fast. You know, because the number of the new usages, you know, like mobility, for example, but also heating and so on, are going to use electricity. But you know, given that, you need to build generation, more generation, electricity generation, and you have to reinforce the grid. Because where you produce electricity, that's clear in the case of solar and wind, is not necessarily where you're going to consume it. So right now it's no big deal because you know, except in Germany, but you know, by and large it's still a small amount, but when it becomes a big amount, you will have to reinforce the grid. And you have to prepare for that because those policies are not very popular either. There was a quick discussion about nuclear power. The general view, you know, whether people were against or for nuclear power, was that we have no choice. You know, we have to keep what exists, because if we get rid of the nuclear power, of course, we are going to go the German way, if I can say so. Apologies for the Germans in the room, but you know, is to use coal instead of using nuclear, and that's not very pretty. We didn't take a stance on new generations, partly because we were incompetent. That's something that, of course, is to be discussed. Let me conclude this particular part of the report I've written with Olivier Blanchard with some generous ideas which we felt were not quite correct. The 4 good ideas. So the first one actually is in reaction to a law in France. There's a recent law which says that if you are a local authority or regional authority of the state and you are looking for a contractor in public procurement, you have to include, it's mandatory, you have to include environmental criteria. So that has to be an explicit part of your choice. That sounds right. We have a no carbon price. And in a sense, we need other tools. However, I think it's wrong. It's wrong because your village, your local authority, your region doesn't have the ability to measure emissions. So they will have to trust the bidders that their data, both direct and indirect through subcontracting, are correct. So they don't have the ability to do that. They don't measure emissions. And then there is a bunch of issues. Well, there is the issue of free riding, of course. Every village is going to say, that's the village next door which has to do it. But there is also cronyism, there is pandering, etc. So basically, coming back to the tomato example, the Zurich mayor, I'm sorry, the mayor is not, he or she is not in the room, but the Zurich mayor might say, oh, we are going to take into account the cost of transportation by road, but we are going to ignore greenhouse, the warming and the emission that goes with it. So, that's an issue. And we are going to have a wide diversity of implicit carbon prices. That's the other issue. Second false good idea is the green central bank. Again, a generous idea, seems it makes sense. But here I have two objections. The first objection is the same as for public procurement. It has to do with the measurement. And the central bank is not equipped to measure the pollution. Of course, the green central bank, that has been said today, should use the climate change for stress tests because it's a systemic risk. It's a macro risk. But beyond that, that's an issue because it's not really able to measure emissions, and it's at risk of losing its independence. Why? Because it's in a political terrain. It has, of course, already done that with quantitative easing and the like. In my view, that was justified, but it's kind of so-so because it gets into the political realm. It's close to it's money. Fiscal dominance and the like, it's actually kind of complex because you get into the politics of the thing. And here you might, by expanding your mission further, you might actually lose your independence at some point. I mean, just imagine the central bank actually saying, I don't want any German bonds because Germany is polluting twice as much as France. Imagine that you got that. I mean, that doesn't sound good, right? But then, why should the central bank take care of climate change and not inequality, education, R&D shortage, and so on? That's dangerous. I think that's kind of dangerous. So my own view, and I think that's broadly the view of the Commission, is that in the end, the state has to assume its responsibilities and not try to get other players, and I'll come back to that later on, to substitute. The state has to impose a carbon tax, has to finance disruptive R&D and the like. Now, if the state doesn't do its job, what should we do? We as citizens, we as firms, we as workers and the like. To discuss this issue, I would like to start with something very strange. It sounds very familiar, but it's very strange if you think about it. The shareholder value approach. Most of the productive sector, the private productive sector in our economies, has to do with shareholder value. There are for-profit firms, and the debt holders may get control over the firm in case of distress, but by and large, investors have control over the firm's decisions, including choosing the manager and various other things. Now, the rationale for that is well known, which is that you have to secure a return on the investment, otherwise you won't lend in the first place and you won't invest in the firm in the first place. So to attract funding, you keep the control rights, which help you actually secure this return. Yes, but in practice, other stakeholders are affected by the decision of management. So you have workers, you have suppliers, you have customers, you have local communities, you have potential polluters and the like. So there are decision anxieties. So you have one group, one particular stakeholders, the investor, making decision on behalf of all the stakeholders. But if you have those basic decision externalities, why is that Milton Friedman most famously said in 1970, the only responsibility of business is to maximize profit? Now, Friedman was a kind of friend of Ronald Coase, another Nobel laureate. They were both in Chicago. And Ronald Coase will say, well, let's lose contracts to take care of externalities. So the idea there is that if you contract, you're going to get some efficient solution. And to some extent, they are used. So if you look, for example, at worker contracts or creditor contracts, they tend to insulate the stakeholders from the managerial decision. So as a worker, you often get a fixed wage. Now you can still lose your job, but then you have severance pay. So you're somewhat protected by a fixed claim. If you look at creditors, they get a fixed interest, interest income, and if there is default, they may get priority and they may get collateral on top of that. That doesn't suffice, so we create exit options for workers and creditors. For creditors, it might be short-term debt to be able to run quickly in case of distress. And for workers, general training, flexible labor market is important as well. But you have to realize that there is only so much that contracts can achieve. First, contracts are imperfect. And then there are kind of collective action problems. So think about almost 8 billion people trying to bargain with each other to solve climate change, right? It will be just totally impossible, not to mention that many of the people who will be affected are not born yet. So they are certainly not going to bargain. And finally, that also gives you an incentive to build a nuisance entity in order to get cash. So I can build a nightclub, an outdoor nightclub next to your house and then come to you and say, haha, why don't you pay me and I won't build a nightclub? Or I will destroy the nightclub. Yeah, I know that doesn't seem efficient. So for those reasons, for 2 centuries, we have applied a kind of mixing of the invisible end of the market. Adam Smith was much, much broader than that. This is really a caricature of Adam Smith. And I will recommend very strongly reading The Theory of Moral Sentiment and not only The Wealth of Nations. But basically using a market and self-interest in order to get efficiency, and then the state corrects the market failures, as Pigou and others and many others have said. So that's why we have a number of desirable regulation in terms of externalities, and climate change, of course, an externality, and all the variants and internalities when we don't stand for our own best interests. So for example, we may be impulsive, we may take drugs or smoke or undersave and so on. There is market power. It's a form of externalities that gives rise to competition policy and regulation. There is consumer protection against asymmetric information. There is a second set of policies which have to do with the deficit of insurance in a market economy. Here in Switzerland, the insurance companies are not allowed to discriminate depending on the kind of illness you have or you will have with genetics, of course. And that's a good thing, because otherwise, of course, people who have a cancer will get a cancer, will never get affordable health insurance. Inequality is a market failure. If you look at behind the veil of ignorance, there is no reason why the current wealth distribution or income distribution will be the one that exists. And equality of chances as well. Behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know in which family you'll be born or in which neighborhood you'll be born. And finally, there is a bunch of societal regulation, from tolerance to protection of minorities and so on. Now, why is that then that the government and the firms and the stakeholders have a social responsibility? The simple answer is that the government fails. And if the governments fail as often as the market fail, because they are captured by lobby, because they pander to the electorate, because there's an issue of jurisdiction. It's very hard to intervene against a country that pollutes or uses child labor unless you invade the country. And there are lots of small misdemeanors, but very frequent ones for which information tells you that the social norm is preferable. Now, it's a twin failure from the market and the government that give rise to social responsibility. And let me focus on one of them, which is corporate social responsibility. So in work we did over 10 years ago with Roland Benabou, that was a course lecture actually, we distinguish between three forms of corporate social responsibility. The first is doing well by doing good. The first time I heard that, I laughed. I thought, no, I mean, who is crazy enough to pollute and then lose money at the same time? It doesn't make any sense. But it can start making sense if you think about the short term versus the long term. Managers sometimes can be very short-termist for whatever reason. They want to keep their job, they want to become famous, they want to cash in the short-term bonus, whatever reason. And for that, they may skip on safety, they may basically not reduce their pollution, they may take excessive risk in banking, for example. And then what CSR is really about forcing the managers to take a long-term perspective, and exercising voice. As shareholders, you want to exercise voice in order to force the managers to do the right thing and take a long-term perspective. It's just profit maximization, if you want. It's just, economists have always stressed that, short-term profit is not profit. It's long-term profit that counts. But then you are going to ask me, why is that CSR? Well, there is a correlation. It's a fortuitous correlation, which is that if you scheme on safety, if you don't abate your pollution, if you take excessive risk, you compromise the future of the firm. That means your workers might well be laid off. There might be lawsuits against the tanker, which after an oil spill and so on. And then the taxpayer will have to pay at some point because the firm is broke and so on. So basically it's a covariation between long-term perspective and protecting the stakeholders. Second point of view is delegated philanthropy. So delegated philanthropy is basically the firm is a channel for the expression of citizen value. You find that the income of coffee growers is too small. You're not going to transfer income to them. You ask Starbucks or whatever to actually engage in fair trade, and you are willing to pay a bit more for your coffee. So basically, the corporation is doing philanthropy on behalf of citizen value. It's profit maximization again, because anyway, Starbucks charges you more for your coffee. And you could do that. We'll discuss, I'm sure, green funds later on. And then the third category is insider, where really the firm loses money in order to make this world a better place. And that's actually what Friedman was arguing against. On the right side of the political spectrum, Robert Reich was also arguing against on the left side, because he thinks that public policy has to be done by the state and not by firms. Now, the one point I want to make, which is kind of obvious but is underappreciated, is only impact matters. Posture doesn't. So lots of economists will think in those ways, but also some philosophers like Peter Singer. I just reproduce a cover of one of his books. And we all want to make this world a better place. We want to have an impact. We just want to not pretend we are green. That makes no sense. But to do that, we need good information and good understanding of economic mechanisms. So let me develop that in a little bit more detail. What are the informational challenges for socially responsible behavior? There's, of course, a free rider issue, which is that I'm willing to pay 10% or 20% more for my Starbucks coffee, but I'm willing to pay twice or three times more. That's free riding. We have to engage in data collection again along the supply chain. It's not easy to do, but conceptually it's simple. So you want to know the performance. It's a little bit more difficult to aggregate. So, what about someone who pollutes versus someone who uses child labor, and someone who, engages in philanthropy and builds a school, or, how do you deal with that? Take climate change and greenhouse gases. What is your impact? As an investor, you like your money to go to something which makes a difference. So the investment should not be additional. There should not be windfall profits. So for example, if you invest in hydroelectricity in Scandinavia, where it already exists, it's not going to change anything. It's just going to be a windfall profit for the owners of those firms. The prime arose with the Kyoto Clean Development Mechanism. There were long discussions of additionality, and I will come back to the CDM, but it's a difficult thing to know because you have to know the counterfactual, and you don't observe the counterfactual. A number of studies tend to show that carbon offsets or US universities' investments in green stuff often don't have an impact. Actually, they invest in things which already exist or will have existed. So that's difficult. It also requires computing future carbon prices, right? If I want, it's an interpret. If there's a project like a forest or a green plant, I have to know exactly what the path of carbon price is going to be, and desirable carbon prices, which is a social cost of pollution to society. Zero net emission pledges often ignore products imported from countries with no or low carbon prices. If there were high carbon prices, that would be fine. But of course, zero net emissions pledges should include imports from countries which have no carbon price or little carbon price. And then there is a credibility issue. And of course, in Glasgow, that's a big issue with the deforestation, with the methane stuff. We get all those 2050 pledges by government, city, private sector, and you ask yourself, what is the credibility? Okay, you can put the courts in charge. At the same time, when countries left the Kyoto Agreement, one after the other, there were no penalty for doing that. Now, this is a difficult issue. So corporate social responsibility, individual social responsibility is important because the government doesn't do its job. So we have to do some of the job. But we have to do it right because we want impact. And that's difficult. Take an issue on which I don't have the answer. And I'm going to be a bit provocative because it's late and I have to wake you up a little bit. But should a socially responsible investor invest in oil? Oh, you're going to tell me, oh, no, never. Of course, oil is very dirty. But if the short-run government doesn't offer any alternative to mobility using gasoline, then the issue, if you exclude oil companies from your portfolio, you are not going to have any impact on pollution. People will keep using their car, period. If you have a best-in-class approach, then you are going to have a little bit of an effect. If you incentivize companies who actually put a lot of effort into reducing their pollution at the extraction and refining stage. So a best-in-class approach sometimes can be good. What about gas? Actually, there's this whole discussion in the EU right now about gas. It's highly polluting, but it pollutes half of what coal does. And you have seen the UK actually getting rid of much of its pollution by switching from coal to gas. Now, is gas a good thing? Of course not. But, how do we deal with that? And, the entire general equilibrium issues are very important. And that's something, it's not only in climate change, it's something that it's very difficult to discuss in politics. I already mentioned the Energiewende in Germany, but there are many other examples like that. So, you do something, take the clean development mechanism. You save a forest, that was a Kyoto clean development mechanism. you save a forest in Indonesia. Sounds nice, right? But then you save this forest, the price of wood, the price of soil goes up a little bit, and there is another forest, either in Indonesia or another country, which is cut because the price has gone up. This is leakage. We economists know about leakage, but those are geoequilibrium effects, and many people don't think about that. So one unexpected social responsibility I want to talk about it's a bit unexpected, is that we have to put pressure on our governments. Okay? I think the governments have lost their economic and moral compass by and large. It's nice to have voluntary commitments, but we need regulation. Without regulation, we are lost. And in this time of populism, we are in kind of political disarray. On the one hand, you have politicians that challenge the independence of central banks, of competition authority, of judges, and so on. They respond to a desire for change. People want a providential ruler which is going to take us out of this mess. At the same time, they pass a buck. So they ask the private sector to do the job, they ask the central bank to do the job. And this is very bizarre if you think that the government doesn't dare to do the job. It's very scared of imposing any carbon price. So there's a lot of greenwashing at the government level. I'm not blaming and I'm not pointing the finger at those people who negotiated COP21, and I promise I won't do it for COP26. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult, but saying it was a victory was kind of strange. Because if you look at the measures, and that was discussed already today, if you have 200 veto rights in the room, then you know that you are going to get the least common denominator, meaning very, very little. Just promises, and in the case of a green fund, collective promises, which is the worst. So we need to actually chase the misconception of the electorate, but also chase our governments to force them to change their behavior. Let me skip the international negotiation because I would like to leave some time for questions and discussions, but let me just conclude with time bombs. So what is a time bomb? The time bomb is a political issue for which if you don't do nothing for a year or two, it just doesn't matter. You don't act on climate change for a year, for 2 years, it just doesn't matter. But 1 year plus 1 year plus 1 year, now it's 3 decades of inactions for climate change. And you could apply that to inequality, you could apply that to pensions, education, public R&D in Europe, public finances, and so on. And the common theme on those policies is that, again, if you don't act for a year or two, it just doesn't matter, so you can wait until the next election. I'm sometimes asked, that's one of the bizarre things that comes to you when you get the Nobel Prize, is that people think you have an answer to everything when you have an answer to a very small subset of things. But they ask me, do you think that COVID is going to be a catalyst for change, that people will really change their behavior and they will realize that we are very fragile? Or is that going to be an echo chamber for moral weaknesses? And the answer is, I just don't know. And my guess is that nothing has changed. I hope I'm wrong, but what I'm sure of is that we need to have a moral compass, and we need also to have an intellectual compass. And for that, we need to have economics and social sciences, places like this one, which are actually going to bring the conceptual framework to change things and bring us closer to the common good, the kind of society we would like to live in if we were beyond the veil of ignorance, meaning that we would not know which place we will have in society. And a little bit of advertising, I'm sorry about that, but I just want to reiterate the fact that it has been a great honor. It's a great honor for me to be giving this lecture. Thank you very much.